All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a terrifying historical whiplash. Really, the darkest chapter in human history, and exploring exactly how a marginalized nobody engineered it all. We're going to trace an escalation arc, a chilling sequence of events that shows precisely how unchecked extremism and deep societal vulnerabilities allowed a failed artist to orchestrate an absolute global catastrophe.
But before we trace that timeline, we've got to ground ourselves with a staggering number: 60 million. That is the estimated death toll of the Second World War. It's a figure so immense, it honestly almost defies human comprehension. It represents just an unfathomable scale of destruction, grief, and loss, unleashed across the entire planet.
So, the big question we're unpacking today is this: how in the world did a homeless, rejected artist orchestrate the deadliest conflict in human history? You know, history isn't just a list of random, inevitable dates. It's a chain reaction. And we're going to examine how systemic economic vulnerabilities, calculated extremism, and a few really fateful choices allowed this nightmare to become a reality.
Section 1. From outcast to soldier. His early life was pretty much defined by profound personal failure and just bitter resentment. Back in 1907, a young Adolf Hitler was rejected by the prestigious Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. He walked into that exam supremely confident, genuinely believing he was a natural artistic genius. But the professors, they found his work unoriginal. Crushed by this rejection, he didn't look inward or question his own talent. Instead, he completely blamed others. His life totally unraveled, forcing him into homeless shelters, and he was sometimes literally sleeping on park benches. And it was during this miserable time in Vienna that he absorbed radical anti-Semitic press, like the Deutsches Volksblatt, desperately looking for a scapegoat for his own monumental failures.
Then, the First World War hits, and it fundamentally changes his trajectory. The army gave him a sense of belonging and a home he never really had. He served as an estafette, which meant running messages across incredibly dangerous trenches, and he was actually awarded the Iron Cross for bravery, an honor he took immense pride in. And here's a bizarre little detail of history. He originally had a large mustache, but he trimmed it down into his infamous toothbrush style, specifically so a gas mask would seal over his face after a British gas attack at Ypres. The military completely transformed him from a wandering outcast into a highly decorated, incredibly dedicated soldier.
Section 2. Finding a radical voice.
So 1918 rolls around, Germany surrenders, and suddenly he's stripped of that military home, replacing his newfound purpose with a really dangerous nationalist rage. And the ultimate powder keg for this resentment was the Treaty of Versailles. This 1919 peace agreement deeply, deeply humiliated the German population. It severely restricted their army to just 100,000 men, and crucially, it assigned Germany the sole financial and moral blame for the entire war. This created a profound sense of national humiliation, providing a perfect, festering wound that he would very soon learn to exploit.
It's wild to think about, but he actually entered politics purely by chance. He was recruited by military intelligence under an officer named Karl Mayr to act as a spy. His job was just to keep an eye on radical groups that were forming among returning soldiers. Well, in September 1919, his spying mission leads him to a small meeting of the German Workers' Party, the DAP, in a Munich brewery. When a speaker there suggested Bavarian separatism, he couldn't contain his anger. He spoke out passionately and, in that moment, discovered his greatest weapon: a choppy, aggressive, and just utterly captivating talent for public speaking.
And this newly discovered voice basically fueled the birth of modern, ruthless political marketing. To make his little fringe party stand out, he rebranded their logo into the swastika. He intentionally stole the bold red color from the communists and the crisp white from the imperial flag just to grab people's attention. He even hired a professional photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, and spent hours practicing in front of mirrors to stylize these theatrical, enraged gestures. On top of that, he used his new SA militia, the brown shirts, to deliberately spark violent brawls at rival political meetings. He manufactured an aura of power, and he absolutely did not care if the press coverage was bad as long as they were talking about him. Publicity was his oxygen.
Section 3. The Ascent to Power. To understand how this fringe Bavarian movement transformed into a national political juggernaut, we have to look at 1923. That's when he tried to seize power by force in a failed coup known as the Beer Hall Putsch, which landed him right in prison. But prison gave him the time to clinically outline his dark vision in his manifesto, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. In it, he laid out his absolute obsessive anti-Semitic ideology and his demand for Lebensraum, this idea of conquering living space in Eastern Europe. The failure of that putsch actually taught him a vital lesson. He shifted his entire strategy from armed revolution to taking over the state legally by dominating the ballot box.
So how did they actually get those votes?
Well, the answer is economic despair. In the late 1920s, the Nazi Party had a marginal 3% of the vote. They were practically nobodies. But then, the 1929 Great Depression hit, bringing massive unemployment, hyperinflation, and widespread misery to Germany. Desperate voters completely lost faith in traditional institutions. By 1930, their vote share spiked to 18%, and by 1932, they reached 33%, becoming the largest party. Economic ruin literally catapulted his extremist platform from the fringes right to the center of power.
But here's the thing. Votes alone weren't enough. Running a massive national campaign required astronomical amounts of money. And we absolutely have to acknowledge the complicity of big business here. Take a look at the words of steel magnate Fritz Thyssen, who openly admitted to giving the party huge annual sums. Lieutenants like Hermann Göring aggressively courted wealthy industrialists, effectively promising them massive, incredibly lucrative rearmament contracts if the Nazis took power. The industrial elite essentially bought into the regime to line their own pockets.
Section 4. Absolute control and rearmament.
After legally being appointed chancellor in January 1933, he wasted no time dismantling the democracy. But to secure the ultimate backing of the traditional German military, he had to resolve a massive brewing internal power struggle between two very violent factions. On one side, you had the SA, the brown shirts led by Ernst Röhm. This was a huge working-class street militia with millions of members who were demanding revolutionary power. On the other side, you had the SS, the black shirts led by Heinrich Himmler. They were a much smaller, elite, racially vetted personal guard, fiercely loyal only to Hitler himself.
He finally made his choice on June 30th, 1934, during an event infamously known as the Night of the Long Knives. In a sudden, incredibly brutal purge, he used the SS to murder Ernst Röhm and the entire SA leadership. By betraying and executing his own early supporters, he proved his absolute ruthlessness, permanently consolidating his dictatorial control over both the state and the military.
Section 5. The Holocaust's industrial terror.
This absolute consolidation of power ultimately enabled the most horrific consequence of his rise, the industrialized extermination of European Jews and other minority groups. Building his war machine required vast resources, and corporate complicity reached unimaginable, sickening depths. There's a chilling contract between the SS and the chemical giant IG Farben, which set a literal price of 3 to 4 marks per day for slave labor. IG Farben deliberately built synthetic oil and rubber plants near Auschwitz. They partnered with the SS, knowingly and intentionally working innocent prisoners to death in horrific conditions purely for corporate profit.
The descent into this hell wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, systematic escalation. It started legally in 1935 with the Nuremberg Laws, which stripped Jewish people of their citizenship. In 1938, it escalated into state-sponsored violence during the Kristallnacht pogroms. By 1941, as the war expanded, mobile squads were carrying out horrific mass shootings in the East. And by 1942, this entire nightmare culminated in the establishment of industrial death camps equipped with Zyklon B gas chambers. It was a completely methodical, state-engineered genocide.
Section 6. The final collapse.
Ultimately, his insatiable drive for absolute global conquest was his undoing. It led him to break his non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, forcing Germany into a doomed war on 2 fronts. And the consequences of his megalomania eventually arrived right at his doorstep. By April 1945, with the Allies advancing from the west and the Soviet Red Army completely surrounding Berlin in the east, his promised 1,000-year empire was reduced to smoking rubble. Hiding deep underground, the dictator swallowed cyanide and shot himself in his bunker, leaving behind a totally shattered continent and a deeply traumatized world.
I want to leave you with this final thought. History isn't inevitable, right? It's a series of calculated choices, ignored warnings, and exploited vulnerabilities. If we can clearly recognize the mechanics of how extremism takes root, how a fringe voice can leverage economic despair, brilliant propaganda, and elite complicity to dismantle a democracy, what are we doing to ensure it never happens again? What warning signs might we be missing today? Thank you so much for exploring this vital explainer with me.